Okay. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Kaori Nagai. I'm a senior lecturer in Victorian literature at the University of Kent, UK, and I'm the principal investigator of the AHRC networking project, Rethinking Fables in the Age of the Environmental Crisis. Fables are characterized by the use of talking animals and other non-humans, and I'm delighted to bring you today's workshop, Animal Languages, as part of our fable project. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers from different disciplines, linguistics, music, sound studies, and literature, and I am really looking forward to hearing their perspectives on this topic. I'd like to thank Christiana Bongart, Professor of English Linguistics at the University of Cologne, for her help in organizing this event. I have been interested in the topic of animal language for some time, but I was excited to learn about her use of linguistic frameworks to explore animal communication and the interspecies relationship. Sadly, she is not able to join us today, but this session emerged out of the conversations I had with her. I'll shortly give the floor to today's fantastic speakers, but before doing so, I'd like to comment very briefly on today's topic, animal language. It is a huge topic and a contentious one. For instance, there has been a strong tradition, especially in Western philosophy, that animals do not have language. It is unique to humans and fundamentally distinguishes us from other species. Many scientists agree, and even an ethologist like Franz de Waal, the author of Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are, believes that humans are, quote, the only linguistic species. We honestly have no evidence for symbolic communication equally rich and multifunctional as ours, outside our species, unquote. Non-human animals are smart, but they do not need language to count, for instance. This is perhaps why fables have been critiqued as a form of animal representation. They do anthropomorphize animals, but the bigger offense is that they give the use of language to non-humans. But I think this makes fables a very interesting space to explore the issue of animal language. It is a name for the fascinating space in which our human language touches and interacts with other species in many different ways. And even if animals do not have human language, they do have their own elaborate communication systems, vocalizations, sounds, gestures, chemicals, etc. And it would be fascinating to rethink and rewrite the fable genre in light of these animal languages. And if fables are full of talking non-humans, this is a manifestation of our wish to understand and communicate with other species. Wherever non-humans speak to us, it opens up a space of the fable, and I'm sure many of you have daily conversations with the animal and other non-human friends. And what better genre is there through which to learn to listen to the non-human, a skill urgently needed for survival in this increasingly precarious world of environmental crisis that we share with other species. Okay, on that note, let's start. So first speaker today is Professor Leonie Cornips. She is affiliated to the research group NLAV, Humanities Cluster of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and Professor Language Culture in Limburg at Maastricht University. Since 1994, she examined sociosyntax, method in dialectology, and bidialectal child acquisition. More recently, her research focused on local identity constructions through language practices, including linguistic placemaking and belonging. At present, she examines intraspecies and interspecies interactions of dairy cows in various settings. She is conducting ethnographic fieldwork among different bands in the Netherlands. And the title of her paper today is Interspecies and Interspecies Acknowledgements by the Dairy Cows. Okay, Leonie, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me, Kaori, and I will share my presentation.
Yes, okay, so second speaker is Andrea Gutierrez. She began her work on animal studies in earnest during her second MA with a thesis on the parrot's voice and the partridge's feathers. Oh gosh, just a moment. Okay, sorry, okay, I'll kind of answer the call. Okay, shall I start again? Sorry. Andrea Gutierrez began her work on animal studies in earnest during her second MA with a thesis on the parrot's voice and the partridge's feathers, the languaging of the animal and animal languages in early Indian text. Work have continued through the present day, and she's deep into researching the history of the captive elephant in South Asia, from medieval through modern times. Her animal publications include a contribution on elephant education, linguistic articulation, punishment, Gajasikas as interspecies communication elephant care manuals of early India in 2023, and embodiment of Dharma in animals in Hindi law in 2018. She is currently preparing a digital edition of an early 20th century elephant care manual from South India as part of a scholar site for the digital humanities called An Elephant Archive. And her paper today is called An Appraisal of Animal Language in Early India from Parrot to Elephant. Okay, Andrea, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you so much. I'm grateful for this whole project, and I want to thank University of Kent and also Kaori for the invitation to present today and share my work. I think I need to, wait, I may have, well, let's hope the sound is fine. If I turn the sound on before, it should be okay. And so, yes, I look forward to our discussion today. This is a mixture of different pieces of work of mine. So I should start by prefacing with what I'm not going to talk about today. And that is really the true fable genre in India, in Indian literature. Animal stories hold a very high place in the Indian tradition, in both the medieval Hitopadesha collection and the much earlier and definitely more famous Panchatantra, which is the most extensive in reach and in number of translations. Other works obviously have talking animals in fable form, Buddhist Jatakas. And so I direct you just to a couple of pieces of scholarship by a mentor of mine, Patrick Olivelle, and these each are published in various sources for really excellent work on talking animals in the fable genre for South Asia and early South Asia. So that's what I'm not going to talk about today. Instead, what I will talk about is to outline some other facets of animal language in historical South Asian texts. So first and most extensively, I'll be talking about and providing an overview of the human appraisal of animals' speech capabilities. And this concerns abilities in oral communication that actual animals possessed, as debated by humans over the centuries. and written in text. And so now some of this discussion implies a switch from animal language per se, which of course can also include things like gesture, body language, eye contact, mimicry, trickery, and so on, things that have been classified and discussed so well by Alex Parrish in his work. So I'm making a switch from animal language per se to animal speech, right? The actual oral expression by animals involving the organs of speech, the tongue, the teeth, the palate, and other places of articulation in the mouth and the throat. And so my aim in exploring what will be mostly grammatical and philosophical texts and their commentaries is to show that these debates actually illustrate perhaps what we can learn about the South Asian past and what was historically valued about animal speech. And so here in particular, I'm referring to parrot and parroting, parroting as the ability of some animals to imitate almost flawlessly human speech. And so I'll provide also a shorter counterpoint where I'll reach into another set of texts in order to explore how Indian writers in the past explained the forms that animal speech takes. So how do writers explain, right? Forming ideologies that try to account for how and why animals, non-human animals, communicate the way they do, why animal speech organs take on the forms they actually have in actual reality, if there is such a thing. And so for both points, I've chosen topics from pre-modern India that are deliberately not projects of anthropomorphizing. Rather, they are intellectual and creative attempts at understanding how and why animal speech capacities are the way they are, right? Although, of course, these discussions do end up reasserting human-animal difference, right? And so both of my discussions revolve around historical Indian understandings of how animal speech actually is or was, rather than projecting, the sort of anthropomorphizing, projecting onto non-human animals. And these sorts of attempts at explaining animal speech are things we've just seen from Leonie Cornips and others as well. I just read this week or last week in the New Yorker, this write-up on researchers studying bird speech and bird song right now. So this has been a constant for more than 2,000 years, right, of figuring out animal speech. To illustrate these appraisals, I will utilize examples that are used in the very texts that I am discussing, animal examples, right? Animals with very different speech capacities. The parrot, or birds more generally speaking, on the one hand, and the elephant on the other. By parrot, I mean what is technically the Indian parakeet, but is conventionally called the parrot, shuka. This is a very colorful animal with a ring around his or her neck, sometimes quite an assortment of colors, about, say, 14 to 18 inches in length, including the tail. By elephant, I mean the Asian elephant, which goes without any further introduction. The problem that we have and had was a very serious one for ancient Indian thinkers of assessing animal speech. After all, there are animals that appear almost able to produce. They appear to be able to produce the speech of humans, birds, and especially parrots, the parakeet, but I will call him or her parrot throughout. And so this particular concern in ancient India arose given a priority on orality. And so we find traditions in the pre-modern period that relied on textual memorization, on oral reproduction, even when at the same time there was a great deal of writing on paper, on stone, on birch bark, on palm leaf, on all kinds of materials, right? So at the same time as writing on paper, we find a reliance on orality, on sacred texts that had been revealed, right, originally orally to human listeners, right, and where transmission of texts from generation to generation took on the same oral transmission that'll include listening and repeating text exactly as heard, right? And so the precision of memorization is involved as a priority of textual preservation, right? Pause there. Mimicry, in other words, parroting, right, is much more highly valued in a tradition where you need to preserve texts orally because paper is less relevant for these religious texts I'm especially talking about. And the priority is on exact preservation and repetition in exact form, right? Much more than any sort of innovation or modification of a text would be. That would be not highly valued, right? So if one couldn't articulate the whole text aloud perfectly from memory and reproduce orally, one wasn't considered an authority on the text, right? So within this value system, parroting was and still is the ideal. And so, of course, the parrot represents this ideal. So much so that the great Indian sages, some were envisioned to be parrots. In the Tamil tradition, we also have sages that were paravai birds, but my example today will be from the Hindu epic Mahabharata, where we find the parrot-headed Shuka, whose name literally means parrot, and he was the son of the writer sage Vyasa, who actually wrote the epic Mahabharata, this famous text, right? And so the work of this parrot son is the repetition and transmission of this great, long, huge work, right? You, in fact, need a parrot to convey and transmit this text to future generations. And so we find that since about at least, let's say 500 before the Common Era, the parrot was the ideal repeater of texts. Parroting was a value across Indian religions, and the parrot was an ideal teacher. And this we see especially in Buddhist texts. And so this context, this underlying background can help us understand the discussions that we are exploring today. And so we're going to take up, these were other examples of parrots as narrators teaching text. We're going to take up the question today in a time around the 2nd to the 1st century before the Common Era with a scholar named Patanjali, who was commenting on the much earlier text that was the first text of Sanskrit grammar, Panini's Sutras. And so this gentleman, Patanjali, asked, is animal and particularly bird speech articulate, and how articulate? So this discussion is actually used to establish difference between human and non-human animals, because Sanskrit language rules indicate that we have different verbal forms that you have to use to express verbs if you're talking about animal speech or animal cries. Animals that are speaking together is the phrase, which would be to each other. And we have to use a different verbal form in Sanskrit than we would use to describe human speech of humans speaking together to each other, right? So the grammar doesn't concern us here, but since we have to use different verbal forms, this was a big problem for grammarians and those who were studying Sanskrit grammar seriously, which was a lot of people, let's face it. And so subsequent debates happened over more than a millennium of discussing the extent of difference between animal and human speech, yeah, because this has to explain why you have to use a different verbal form, regardless of which verb you use to talk about animal cries or animal speech. In debating what was more articulate, the key was vyakta. What constitutes vyakta, articulateness, in human rather than animal voices, right? Patanjali argued things like, well, the bird speech seems to be articulate. And he says, you know, a rooster says cock-a-doodle-doo or cuckoo in Sanskrit, really. And so why does this animal voice require a different verb than many human articulate voices would, right? And so he also uses examples including parrot and myna voice, which both appear to be intelligible, he says. He says we can understand the utterances of such birds. And so commentators like Patanjali were debating what constituted articulate speech and who has it, right? For Patanjali, articulate meant not only manifested and intelligible, but especially articulate in voice. Some kind of special is involved here. This would mean, Patanjali concluded, this has to be a voice that is able to articulate all of the sounds, varnas he calls them, the phonemes you might say, in the Sanskrit alphabet, right? And so this grammarian was gesturing to a perceived lack in animal speech, and he uses as point of comparison one very elite language system of humans, right? The refined Sanskrit language. So in the end, Patanjali concludes that cuckoo, or cock-a-doodle-doo, is really a human imitation or approximation of what roosters say, and not really what roosters vocalize. So he says it's an upama. This is what humans think or express that roosters are communicating with, which are really different sounds that are manifest, right? If we move ahead over 1,000 years in this, what was a written debate, we find another grammar commentator, Kayara, of the 11th century, and he continues the discussion, and he writes that parrots, mynas, and other birds do not innately, swabhavikam, have an articulate voice. What's this? He writes that the range of some of their sounds in parrots, mynas, and so on, is because of the will, vasha, and effort of humans, right? Meaning that humans must be present for parrots to articulate articulately. Of course, he was rather astute in observing that it's only caged birds, birds in captivity, or at least in regular contact with humans, who adopt these speech patterns of human language. This is something that Western biologists only came to record and note in the 20th century. Regardless, moving forward in time, closer to our modern era, with Nagesha, we see an observable shift toward a different ideology, perhaps, of greater human exceptionalism, so that by the 17th and 18th centuries, this Sanskrit language commentator, Nagesha, claims that animals lack an articulate voice that's like that of humans, and that's why you have to use a different verbal form, right? This whole debate on animal voice ends up reasserting human-animal difference, increasingly so over the centuries. But these experts in language did not commit anthropo-denial of the sort that Frans de Waal is famous or well known for discussing, right? These scholars did not underestimate commonalities between human speech and other animal speech, right? Patanjali himself problematized human notions about what constitutes language and speech and what we think about animal voice. So even though for him human language and human speech was special and privileged, he defined human speech in the context of other forms of speech, right? He's accounting for more. My next example of the historical appraisal of animal speech comes not from the grammar tradition, but from philosophy, a totally different intellectual debate, where we find philosophers questioning things like, can parrots be teachers of texts to others? Can we learn knowledge from parrots? What is remarkable in these intellectual debates is that philosophers, so he was engaging and responding to some other thinkers, philosophers, especially around this medieval period, took animal language and cognitive capacities very seriously and found it worth discussing and recording in their writing. I'm thinking in particular of this Gangesha, a new logician of the 14th century, although there were preceding schools of philosophy, and not even within his own school, that more or less were in agreement on most of the points of his argument. So for Gangesha, parrots did have knowledge of words and of the sequence of words, and were able to construct sentences that can lead a listener to valid cognitions. So for this philosopher, parrots' knowledge of words allowed them to form words in sentences or sequences, yeah? And upon being heard by a human listener, this could result in a human acquiring knowledge or some new understanding, or the human could listen and realize that the utterance contained a fallacy and say, no, 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 that's not right. And so a parrot's utterances can persuade humans of the relation of the bird's statements to reality, to factual reality. That was a concern for these philosophers, right? Now, these these philosophers were not saying that parrots always necessarily knew exactly what they were saying in all circumstances, right? This would be more akin to a situation of, let's say, a gifted child who is reading aloud from a book on quantum physics, and you could listen and may in fact learn quite a lot from this child's recitation from the book. But there could also be parts that the child, him or herself, didn't comprehend while reading, right? So we're not assuming full understanding in a semantic sense, perhaps, all the time at least, right? Nonetheless, the bird constructs meaningful sentences from word knowledge alone, Gangesha said. And what's more, bird utterances can be authoritative and can result in knowledge. That is, can result in you learning, due to the parrot's statements conforming to an original past utterance. This is the parroting thing, right? It's due to the parrot's impeccable ability to mimic another person's voice that they can be teachers or provide testimony. And this could even be in a court of law. Yeah, we've got all kinds of, from the story tradition as well, story traditions, stories of parrots giving away what's really been happening, for example, among lovers, so on. Really, this discussion of Gangesha is an epistemological question of the means or sources of knowledge, pramana, that can act as authority or authoritative, right? How we learn, how we come to know things. Sources or valid means of attaining knowledge in most epistemological systems of South Asia include things like you have direct or firsthand experience. For example, you feel heat, you know there's fire, you're going to burn yourself, right? That's learning something. You also have inference, where you can smell or see the smoke, and that's how you come to understand there's fire, right? All sorts of other common sources of knowledge. Not all are agreed upon in all the schools of philosophy, but that's fine. The one of concern to us today that gives us pause is verbal testimony. Yeah. Testimony is how a professor, for example, passes on knowledge to students in a classroom in the conventional sense, speaking in a lecture, as I am now, and also how, let's say, the author of a written book would transmit knowledge. It would be verbal testimony. We accept, or we don't accept, the author's testimony to be true and veridical. Yeah, it's still testimony, right? So far, we have found that parrots and chickens can almost perfectly, but not quite, produce the articulations of the Sanskrit language, but can, without a doubt, serve, and this is according to these philosophers, serve as teachers or as witnesses, providing testimony in a court of law in early India, speaking utterances that result in new knowledge or new understanding among human listeners. So what then of the elephant, my counterpoint for today? It may surprise many to learn, or maybe it doesn't surprise you at all, that the elephant is acknowledged in many Indian texts from the earlier period, pre-modern period, to have the capacity to work in multiple languages, to comprehend many human languages when captive elephants are trained, I am referring to. I'm sharing a couple of these examples here for you now. And here I'm segueing from what were more philosophical or grammatical texts into the realm of, from now on in, the epic. Epics are sometimes considered legendary, right? But Hindu epics, such as the Mahabharata, and I'm going to give an example or two from this work, form part of a group of literature that's called itihasa. This literally means how things were. It was like this, right? In modern languages of North India, itihasa is the word for history, right? And so this is how things were in the past, right? It was like this in the past. So with this, I'm going to share with you one history, it's an etiology, of how elephants lost the ability to speak and became inarticulate. And this means, of course, there was a prior, earlier historical moment, and not just assumed, but we have described in text as well, when elephants could speak and in fact could sing. I've put a little passage here from an elephant song. And Goldman has a short text on this if you'd like to read an article on elephant song. The etiology that I'll be talking about explains why elephants now cannot speak. And I'm showing you this image on purpose so you can see the points of articulation and the speech organs of the elephant, or at least part of them, not the ones deep in the neck. And so this etiology explains why the elephant can't speak articulately now and why elephant tongues point backwards. They're not able to bring their tongues to the front of their mouth or outside protruding at all. Why would they need to? They have a trunk, and that's fabulous, right? So here is sort of a summary of the story. The gods wanted the god of fire, Agni, to fight one demon named Tartaka, and Agni didn't want to fight, and so he runs away instead, and he's trying to hide from all of the other gods. And one elephant in the forest sees him and gives him away. He reveals Agni's location to all the other gods. This pleases the gods, but Agni is furious and upset. Why did you give me away? Why did you tattle on me? And so Agni curses all two-tuskers, all elephants, saying, your tongues will go backwards. You've got a lot of curses and boons in the epics of India. But the gods, of course, were very happy and very pleased that this elephant had told the truth, yeah, and had said where Agni was and said, no, 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 even with your tongues going backwards, you can't reverse the curse of someone else. But even with this, tongues unable to move out of the mouth, you will still be able to eat all kinds of food. You'll be able to voice out, and the word is vacham, which is the word for words or speech. You'll be able to voice out words or speech whose syllables are inarticulate, again, we find. And so this is sort of compromise, and explains why elephants have the tusk, right? Because their tongues don't have this capacity for moving food in the mouth and so on. And so we have this really quite amusing and interesting story accounting for, it's an etiology to explain why elephant tongues go backwards. And the elephant's mouth is a very, very strange thing. In cases of captivity, of course, elephants in captivity feed themselves too with their trunks, but where you have humans feeding, you can see here quite readily that the human has to put the hand quite deeply in the mouth if the elephant is not expected to use the trunk. And really, because the elephant will be unable to move the food using the tongue, him or herself. Here's yours truly, I'm feeding an elephant, and wow, that's as far, you can see most of my arm, but the tongue is not, I don't have a pointer now, the tongue is not any farther toward the front of the chin, right? I have to have this far in to be able to get the food to reach to be able to be swallowed, right? But of course, the elephant in real life uses the trunk, so this is not real life in normal non-captive existence, and eating on his or her own. The elephant just feeds herself, right? And so this is not an issue, but we have this textual explanation of what is a different system of points of articulation, right? Of points of contact of the tongue and other surfaces of the mouth that are instrumental in Sanskrit and are much discussed in the language tradition as shiksha, articulation and pronunciation in Sanskrit. And so this is something that's discussed not only for humans, but for other animals too, we find. So what does this all mean? What can we learn from understanding how elephants lost the ability to speak articulately, or that parrots can actually be teachers and treated as teachers, and used as sources of knowledge and testimony, witnesses? What do we learn of the debate on exactly how a chicken's voice is or is not articulate? Ancient and medieval Indian writers were willing to grant animals some of the same speech capacities as humans. The elephant, on the other hand, had very different speech production abilities. And this also has to be explained, or had to be explained. How could elephants come to have such strange tongues and throats, right? Finally, Indian thinkers were willing to take parrots on as potentially valid sources for acquiring new knowledge. The parrot, in fact, can be your teacher. Overall, we find ancient and medieval writers putting non-human animals on a spectrum, perhaps, of speech production, on the same spectrum as humans. And so this is one of degree and not kind, to go back to Darwin's phrase. These are not opposing binaries where humans possess reason and some specialness that non-human animals don't have, right? We don't have this situation where animals are wholly unlike humans. But it is precisely on this point of a voice's articulateness that we find the criterion for distinguishing between human and animal. And animals were never regarded as speechless or languageless, as we do find in Western sources, especially from the philosophical tradition, as Ka already mentioned. But for pre-modern India, animals were generally considered limited in voice capacity, right? But of course, you don't have to take my human word for it. So thank you so much for today. I look forward to our discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Anna, are you here? Yeah, I'm so like Gosh, I just got your message saying you are involved in a car accident. I'm
Yes,
so
it's
glad
a small, I'm in New Orleans. New Orleans has huge holes, and sometimes it happens that your tire goes into one of those holes and it explodes. So I was rushing. I'm sorry. I apologize for arriving late, but I'm here.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, so wonderful. Okay, so Anna Ocha Gautier, she's a professor in the Newcomb Department of Music and the Department of Communication and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the Tulane Universities in New Orleans. Her work is on histories of listening and the decolonial, on sound studies and climate change, and on the relationship between the creative industries, the literary and the sonic in Latin America and the Caribbean. Her current project explores the bioacoustics of life and death in colonial history of the Americas and the relationship between sound, climate change, and the colonial. She has many publications, but which includes Orality, Listening, and Knowledge in 19th Century Colombia, which was awarded the Alan Millian Prize of the Society for Ethnomusicology. Okay, on that note, yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
And that's so great.
I'm going to share. So I apologize, first of all, for arriving late. And but that's climate change in the, at the epicenter of climate change in New Orleans. The city is sinking. It's sinking badly. So I'm sorry, besides the hurricanes. I'm going to share my my keynote and here. Okay, and so what I want to talk about today is the following. My work has concentrated. I'm going to grab 3 instances that are very different of the type of work I've been doing since 2010, more or less. So let me give a little bit of a background. I'm an ethnomusicologist. I work with music, and I became interested in sound, or a broader conception of the sonorous, because it would include the fuzzy boundary between language and music. Because my dog is barking. Because that boundary is very fuzzy in many cultures of the world. In fact, many cultures of the world do not have a name for music as such, or for language as such. So as I studied colonial archives of the 19th century in Colombia, I was interested in first a post-colonial, which later in Latin America became a decolonial question, which is the question of how animal languages are classified. Or I'm sorry, how humans are classified according to how their voices sound. So I didn't begin with that question. I began with a question of how are the histories of knowledge about language and music done in Colombia and in Latin America in general. And so, but I ended up with that question. So I'm going to do a little bit of a trajectory. And this is Colombia. I work in Colombia and more generally in the Caribbean islands and now the Eastern United States as well. And we'll arrive there and I'll tell you why. This is, as you see, Colombia has a border line with the Caribbean Sea and with the Pacific Ocean. And the largest river, which I have highlighted in green there, is called the Magdalena River. And you would have to go down that river. The Panama Canal did not exist in the 19th century in order to reach the capital of the country in Bogota, which is the end of the green line, or even to go to Ecuador and Peru.
Anna,
So
I
there
don't
was
think
We
we're
can't
seeing
see that the picture.
we're not seeing the slide.
Oh,
Sorry to interrupt. We just
okay.
see animal languages. Okay, okay.
Oh, has it, let me see why it's not play. It's not moving?
Now we see a map. Yeah, but if you play.
Yeah, if I play, okay. Hopefully it'll play. Okay, thank you so much. So as you see, the map begins in the Caribbean Sea and ends in the Andes ranges in Bogota, the capital city. That was the entry point to South America, not only to Colombia, during the 18th and 19th century and earlier in the colonial period, okay? It was very difficult to go inland. You see the mountain ranges through land. You had to go through sea to Bogota, and then you would go. So what does this mean? This means that there were boat rowers all over the area and all over the country. So I was doing this project of trying to understand music and language in the 19th century and early 20th century to do, let's say, a decolonial history of ethnomusicology. And then I ran across a passage written by Alexander von Humboldt. And I will read it. It's published in my book, but I will read it because I want to see how this changed my project completely. And that's why I ended up writing about the boundary between the animal and the human. And so this is a passage written in 1801. It is found in Alexander von Humboldt's diary, not in his published text, although that diary has since been published. And then therefore it's maybe a little bit more intimate. So I'm going to read it. And he's talking about the boat rowers called bogas of the Magdalena River, the river that I just showed, because he's going down the river to Bogota to meet the botanists in Bogota. So I read, this is Humboldt's description of them. They are free men, sometimes very arrogant, unruly, and happy. So they're a mix of indigenous and Afro, but they're not slaves. And I'll say why later. Their eternal happiness, their good nutrition, all of this diminishes the feeling of compassion for them. But the most upsetting thing is the barbarous, lustful, ululating, and angry shouting, which is sometimes like a lament and sometimes joyful, at other times full of blasphemous expressions through which these men seek to handle their muscular effort. About this point, we can make quite a few interesting psychological observations. All muscular effort decomposes more air in the lungs than during repose. To bring air into the lungs, it is also necessary to expel more vitiated air. That is why in heavy work, the emission of cries and sounds is quite natural, not language or music. If the type of work has a regular cadence, like wood cutting, etc., then a psychological factor is added. The pleasure for cadence requires that the tones be expressed in a more determined way, how, hum, hal. If you add all that you can imagine, the tone becomes a song and even a dialogue. So this shout is earlier than song and then language, This is an evolutionary line. Thus, the heavier the work, the more angry the screaming of the bogas, among whom the cadence will be affected frequently by caprice. They begin with a sibilating has and end with exacerbated insults. Especially each bush from the shore that they can reach with the pole is saluted in the most improper fashion. The has rapidly turns into a bellowing ruckus, into a blasphemy. The racket you hear uninterruptedly until you reach Bogota is as bothersome as the steps of the bogas on the roof of the ship called the Champan. Do you see the next slide? No?
I see the map.
You still see them? That is so odd. Okay, so let me just go to the next slide and then make it bigger. Do you see it now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so that's the boat of the bogas. They're having poles. They're on the rooftop. The Europeans or Creoles, white mestizos are inside of the boat. And this took from 3 weeks to 3 months between the Caribbean and Bogota. So what does this mean? This means that the bogas sounds were everywhere. I read more or less 20 travel books down the Magdalena River when I found this. I thought, I don't know what to do with this, but I cannot discard it. And so what you have is that the boga sounds are everywhere, but they never made it into the books of folklore or into the books of language. Why? Because they sound like animals. So in the book, I have 8 more citations of the 20 books I read, and systematically their language is described as an animal sound. The same happens with indigenous languages. I'm not going to stay with that very long, but what concerned me is the following. is that the voice, the use of the voice, when it could not be classified as either a proper language or a proper music, was used to animalize humans there where animals are considered lesser beings than humans. So philosophically, the problem of the conquest in the Americas was, are the indigenous people humans or not, right? Do they have a soul? And this problem will continue to appear throughout the colonial history. And so my book became a book about the voice in delineating the boundary, but I'm hearing human voices, not animal voices, humans that get classified as juridically unable to take care of themselves. Thus, a philosophical problem, which is, are they more human or more animal? And therefore, how do we treat them? Becomes a juridical issue. And then it's this transposition between the philosophy of hearing humans as animals, human voices as animals. And I saw the cat go by. And then that's okay. I have my two dogs in front of me. And so after that, there were a series of laws that were passed that said these people are not human enough. They are the lowest grade of racial categories in Colombia. Therefore, they do not have a right to proper modes of citizenship. This happened also with indigenous languages that were not deemed aesthetically pleasing. So that's basically what my concern has been. How is listening to what I am generally categorizing as a voice? And a voice can include musical sound, what we call musical sounds, or what we call languages, used in colonial settings to determine the juridical value of humans, and today the juridical value of animals as well. So I became very interested in this colonial issue and the transformation of that into a juridical decision. So for example, indigenous peoples in the 19th century in Colombia were heard as having not aesthetically pleasing languages. We had a series of grammarian presidents that were philologists. I'm from Colombia, sorry. So Colombians. And one of those wrote the 1899 Constitution. And when he wrote the 1889, when he wrote the Constitution, I'm sorry, 1886, when he wrote the Constitution, what he decreed was that indigenous peoples did not have a proper language, and therefore they would be under the jurisdiction of the missionaries. And that lasted until well into the 20th century. So they had no juridical coverage outside of the church. So this has like major consequences for an extension of colonial situations beyond the post-colonial moment. And I became fascinated by that, interested in that, and therefore, in a way, broadly, my book deals with how notions of culture are interrelated to notions of nature. They mutually bind each other, depending on the historical moment that we're dealing with. Okay, so that's one example that I wanted to open with. And I'm going to go to another example, which is the one two more examples, which are the ones that I'm researching now. So after I finished a book on the 19th century, very centered on the Hispanic archive, I became very interested of the historical expansion of the United States into the Caribbean and Central America, including Northern Colombia, the same area in Colombia in the early 20th century. Through the rise of banana plantations, particularly a company called the United Fruit Company, which is a massive plantation endeavor that took place in 9 countries. And they also created the cruise system in the Caribbean and major radio interventions. They also, in their cruises, had traveling musicians from New Orleans to where those bananas were brought into the US to Central America. But I also became very interested in underwater. This is by chance. The development of underwater surveillance. And again, the sound surveillance. So I found this material. So I'm going to go to this material on sonic surveillance. So I found this material initially in a very public document, which I think many of you might have seen, which is a film called The Sonic Sea. And it's a film, it's a documentary that's about how anthropogenic noise, it was produced in 2016, is killing basically marine mammals. And this film opens with a marine biologist called Kenneth C. Balcom giving a testimony on a stranding of whales, of 17 whales in the Bahamas on 2000. I'm going to read that testimony which the film opens, and I'm going to talk about this character, Kenneth C. Balcom, which I ended up researching, and how I ended up in this study of underwater surveillance and its tie between marine naval surveillance and being able to listen to whales and document their sounds. So the film begins with the following citation: March 15th, 2000. This is Kenneth C. Balcom. Day of infamy, as far as I'm concerned. I woke up in the morning, started having coffee, telling our team of people that the chances of seeing a whale in a 10-day period are slim. My assistant Dave came running inside and said, "Ken, there's a big whale on the beach right in front of the house." And sure enough, there was a goosebeak whale swimming, moving the tail. In my mind, or maybe out loud, I said, "What are you doing here? They're supposed to be in deep water." So I pushed it back to sea. It swam out a little ways, then came back in. We did this 2 or 3 times, and then the neighbors came along and said, "There's another one down at the point." We covered it with sheets and kept splashing water on it, or else kept trying to push the other whale out. And then our neighbors came and said, "There's another whale." It was devastating. By the end of the day, there were 16 dead whales. Animals that I had grown to know over a 10-year period were dead. I was driven to find out why. The next day, he flies over the sea close to where the strandings take place, and he says, "We searched around and found more specimens, but we also saw military ships, U.S. Navy destroyer and mother warships." And then I just put the 2 and 2 together. The warships were sounding their sonars with very high intensity and frequency sound, a screeching tone that's hard to listen to, overpowering. I can't imagine anything more absurd than dropping acoustic bombs in downtown cities. It's the equivalent. He then proceeded to send 6 whale heads to a total of 16 to Harvard medical school in order to collect evidence to see what had killed them. The CAT scans revealed the whales had hemorrhage around the brain and ears. While the Navy initially denied its responsibility in the whale strandings, the fact that the evidence had been collected, this for me is crucial, again, a juridical issue, made it possible to carry out an investigation. And on January 7, 2002, the U.S. Navy had concluded that it killed at least 6 whales with an accident involving common ship-based sonars. What they did not admit was that they were probably trying out a new low-frequency sonar system, the Certes LFA, that was being then tested by the Navy, and they were waiting for the permit by the National Marine Fisheries Service. They did a lawsuit. Malcolm did a lawsuit, and 2 years later they won, and this became a central lawsuit in the admission, the juridical admission, that sonars killed whales. So it's interesting because there's a scientific knowledge of that, but there's no juridical admission until there's evidence. And so my question was, what are they doing in the Bahamas? Why is Balcom in the Bahamas? And why does he collect evidence immediately? So he collects evidence immediately because he himself in the 1940s was in the Navy. And he was assigned to a secret, top secret mission that existed then, which was listening stations positioned throughout the Caribbean, especially in the Bahamas, with a system known as the SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. The system was secret and was declassified in 1991. And I will add to talk about what the SOSUS was. It was in the mid-1950s during the Cold War. The US Navy installed an underwater surveillance system to track submarines. And it was a multi-billion-dollar operation of hydrophone arrays, that is, sets of hydrophones that were located in the deep ocean in the Caribbean, because they discovered something called the SOFAR. All this was military naval secret research. And the SOFAR is an ocean channel that allows sound to travel long distances. It is used by whales. Basically, my understanding, I'm an ethnomusicologist, I've had to read a lot about these sound transmission in the water to be able to understand this. And the water in the deep ocean, as is characteristic in that part of the Caribbean, is heavier and saltier because it's colder. There's a middle channel, which they call the SOFAR. And then the water in the top is lighter and less salty and warmer, which means that if you emit a sound in that channel, the sound wave will bounce against the roof and against the bottom. So it's like the other waters would create like a line for the sound to travel. So that sound travels. So they discovered they could hear submarines and whales. And the SOSUS was the hydrophone, was the system with which whales were first listened to by naval military officers who were searching for submarines during this was invented it was discovered between the Second World War and the Cold War. So again, what happens then, and this is the Syrtis LFA, which they were trying out the day of the beach stranding in 2000 in the Bahamas. Again, it's this time the SOSUS is what is called a passive sonar, which is that it only picks up sounds but doesn't emit. But the Syrtis LFA is an active sonar, which means it emits sound and receives sounds. And the emission of sounds is not like the whales. This technology is all based on whale echolocation, which is the form that they listen. But they emit sounds in such a way, in such low frequency, that the animals can't stand the pain. They rise rapidly, and they bleed through the ears, and they die basically of compression sickness. So a lot of whale and dolphin strandings around the world have to do with these types of active sonars that are happening that are being used all over right now for both industrial and military purposes. So I became very interested in this because, again, the possibility of listening to whales. And for example, Balcom said he began surveilling for submarines, and then the first thing he heard whales for the first time. And he became a marine biologist to be dedicated to whales the rest of his life when he left the Navy. And so there's a relationship between a colonial situation of imperialism, in this case, of the US in the Caribbean, and the geophysical mapping of the undersea in the Caribbean that happens, and the discovery of sound transmission systems and the invention and engineering of machines that derived from animal sounds. So the listening to animal languages and the classifying of those Anglo-Lingual language is tied to an imperial expansion and to the invention of sound machines that are able to listen and to produce sound, depending on what type of sonar they're using, in a certain way. So again, I am very interested in this juridical boundary in which it is obvious that these sound producing, they have the scientific knowledge to say, yes, this kills whales. And this, of course, has to do with not only animal languages, but animal listening. And I'm interested in how listening determines whether an animal has language or music, right? And so here the listening becomes the linchpin to the link between the military expansion undersea and the listening to the animal sound as eventually music and a viable language. So I'm very interested in this history. There are many more inventions of materials that I'm exploring right now of sound equipment. And that is an ongoing process. There's a couple of articles that will come out soon. Now, this, of course, ties this more recent element to trying to do an anthropogenic history of the Caribbean, in which I tie the geophysical mapping and the study of sound transmission to the way the Caribbean was understood. Instead of just a social understanding, trying to do these anthropogenic histories. And of the relation between what is ambient, what is an animal, and the relationship to listening. So I'm going to go to my final example. And my final example is a very well-known one. And I begin with her because this is Rachel Carson, who published a book in 1962 called Silent Spring. Silent Spring was a path-breaking book. Rachel Carson is considered the mother of the environmental movement in the United States. And this was a book that basically created a scandal. It denounced the use of agrotoxics in the United States, particularly DDT, because they were killing birds. And she is a woman. Yes, I have one more minute.
Yeah,
Oh,
also the slide is,
yeah,
yes.
okay. I'm so sorry. So here, did you see this? The so far?
Mhm.
No. Oh my gosh, you should have stopped me. Okay, so here's the so far, and this is the channel. Okay. So under what the darker blue is heavier water, the lighter blue on top is lighter water, and the so far is the channel. That's what whales use to transmit sound. That's also what naval officers used to try to listen to enemy submarines. Okay, sorry, I had not noticed that I had moved. I'm going to put the next, but the image helps a lot. Okay, so that's where they drop the hydrophone arrays. They drop them in that channel so that that travels thousands of kilometers from the Caribbean all the way to the UK. Okay. And I'm going to do the next, I have no idea why this is not working. And this is the Certus, which is the active sonar that killed the whales in the Bahamas. So it has different parts. Active sonar, again, means that it produces sound, and at the same time, it receives sound. So they have these arrays, which are these strings of hydrophones and these strings of sound-producing objects that are carried out. And what they do is that they produce waves of sound. So they use echolocation, but it's not a controlled echolocation like the whales. It's a massive echolocation in which they're constantly surveying to see if they're enemy submarines. Even if today they're experiments, they're military exercises. But that has produced several of the strandings of today. Okay, and that produced the stranding in the Bahamas that day, even though they did not admit that they were testing this equipment. Okay, again, scientific knowledge, but it's not until you have evidence, which was what Balcom knew how to do because he had been in the Navy and he had learned how to use the SOSUS then, and he was also became an oceanographer. Okay, so final. This is Rachel Carson. I don't know how much you know about her, but she's considered the mother of the environmental movement. And she talks a lot about sound in all of her books, including the books that she wrote about the ocean in the 1950s, but very especially Silent Spring, which has the title Silent. And I was very interested in that because silence has a key aesthetic issue to determine what is called ambient sound, which is a category developed by an avant-garde musician called John Cage, also very famous. A decade or a couple of decades before 1962, before Rachel Carson's Spring. So my thinking was, how come we never think of Rachel Carson as generating a theory for ambient sound as well? Not just the mother of the ethnomusicology, of the environmental movement. So her book begins, and this is the linchpin, I think, to this in this talk, to this panel. The first chapter of Silent Spring is called A Fable for Tomorrow. This is a science book that begins with a fable. And that fable says that the voices of birds are no longer heard. It's the voices of birds that are the key to the effects of the pesticide. Let me read that small passage. So this is her detailing what had happened in this imagined small town in the middle of America, where there are no longer birds that are being heard. This is the fable with which the book begins. Everywhere was a shadow of death. The farmers spoke of much illness among their families. In the town, the doctors had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness appearing among their patients. There had been several sudden and unexplained deaths, not only among adults, but even among children who would be stricken suddenly while at play and die within a few hours. There was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where had they gone? Many people spoke of them, puzzled and disturbed. The feeding stations in the backyard were deserted. The few birds seen anywhere were moribund. They trembled violently and could not fly. It was a spring without voices. On the mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, catbirds, doves, jays, wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was now no sound. Only silence lay over the fields and woods and marsh. So I'm going to stop there. But the centrality of the sonorous element in the book is enormous. So it determines, it's this absence of the bird voice, what she calls a voice. She calls them as having a voice. And that's the metaphor that is used for the death of the birds. However, I think it's much more than that. I think that for Carson, if you read her previous books on the ocean, Carson is a great literary writer and an excellent scientist. And her previous books, which were, let's say, literary public books on the ocean, have a lot of sensory material. There's constant listening to animals. There's constant description of animal voices and sounds. And therefore, her, let's say, evolution into a critical thinking about toxicity follows a path that is not only scientific, but also literary. And I'm going to stop there and just arrive at a conclusion because I know my time is up. Just to round everything up, these are all examples in which the flimsy boundary, philosophical boundary between the animal and the human voice ends up being a juridical issue that then has to be struggled over, whether that be for the defense of animal lives or human citizenship. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I apologize for this not moving.
Yeah, thank you so much for Anna. It's fascinating, and there's a lot of overlap with other, the two previous talks. We still have about 25 minutes for questions. Do you have any? Who would like to go first? Yeah, what okay, you think what you are thinking. I was very struck by the kind of link between Andreas and Anna's paper. So it's like so animal language is not there, but it's to do with the law, like how to make like uh, so about this becomes a question with the grammar and also law, and then it is actually almost like we decide which animal speaks and so on. So it was very and also I started with this like session about the importance of listening to animals, but it's become very political. We have to think about how to listen as well. Yeah. Okay. Do anybody have questions? Yeah, Maisie.
Hello, hi everyone. And thank you so much. What three absolutely fascinating talks. I've got questions for everybody, but I'm gonna choose one, and then maybe I'll have another chance later on. We'll see, or maybe can do it over email. I suppose actually it's more of a comment and then a question for Andrea. So I really enjoyed your paper, and I found a sort of interesting contrast with some work that I'd read about following seeing somebody else's paper at a conference. It's not my area per se. I was interested in this idea that elephants could speak and lost the ability to speak because of some kind of spiritual fall. And it really reminded me of work that's been done to explore the idea that humans once had a language of the animals that was believed to be a natural language. Many of you are probably more familiar with this than I was. Humans had this language which was believed to be a natural language, which was believed to be more direct than the kind of language that could be seen when humans learned to lie after the fall. And of course, this is in the English tradition. And there was this search for the original human language, which was believed to be the language, among some, to be the language of animals and to be a pure and wise expression in contrast to the lies and deceit of humans after the fall. So I was really struck by the kind of reversal almost of this Asian story with the kind of early modern English story of how it was humans who fell and humans who lost the ability to speak like animals. And I wondered whether you had come across that. Forgive my ignorance if everybody knows that on this call. And whether you'd thought of any kind of interesting contrasts further to that.
Oh, it's lovely. Thank you for your insights. For the elephant, it's not entirely a spiritual fall. So this is also legendary past when elephants also could fly, right? Despite being very heavy beings. But rather, I mean, of course, I see what you're saying as a spiritual fall, but it's because the elephants are telling the truth because they can't help but tell the truth that this happens and the gods get angry, right? So, and in other stories, we find the elephants are telling the truth and giving away and revealing other elephants who will get captured, right? This is the elephant song. And so it's spiritual. I guess they're too good, right? But yeah, fascinating connections. I don't know about sort of humans having animal language or speech, but you have many texts from ancient India where, so one of the Vedas, these oldest sacred texts, there are three oldest collections and maybe four. The Samaveda is the one that's sung, and so this is also for Anna Ochoa. The Samaveda is sung, and it's much more like animal sounds like or bird like in song. They're things that are nonsensical, they're not semantic words, right? You have other Sanskrit, I don't know, it's part of one Upanishad that's like meant to sound like animal sound, right? Where it's usually as a word, distinguishable as a word, but shifts into animal sound production. We also find some omens. There's some upcoming work, and he's done many in the past. Kenneth Zisk has done work on omens that are actually imitating birdsong. So humans will say these incantations is probably not the way to describe it, but sort of mantra-like, and they're meant to sound like birds. It's imitating bird song, right? So this has also in chant form has been a common sort of trend where you might say you do have an imitation of animal sound, and this will be sort of interjections in word sound in this very old literature, let's just say from, I don't know, 1000 BCE for the Samaveda. That's probably not going to be 100% accurate, but I would give that date around there. And Upanishad with imitating the animal sound around 500 BCE, and these bird omens meaning to sound like birds, maybe 6th century of the Common Era. So you have a lot of this. It's not quite answering your question. It's the best thing I can think of.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've put the name of the person who wrote about it, Sandra Cottam, in the talk, and she talks about birds. She talks about the Sufi, the Muslim spiritual elite who are believed to speak the language of the birds, who could be the only ones who could communicate with the birds, and that was seen to be a form of lost wisdom, spiritual wisdom. But yeah, take your point about the elephants and their sort of yeah, that it wasn't necessarily a spiritual fall, it was through spiritual excellence.
Okay, so next one, the Shariasi.
Hi everyone. It was a lovely, lovely presentation. I love all the presentation. My question is, like it connects both to Andrea's presentation and Leonie's. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And I was wondering, like, what are your thoughts on how, like, so basically this comes from a previous discussion that I was attending, that language is supposed to be communicative, and communicative means that you're creating something in that through language. So did you, while like Leonie, when you were with those animals, with cows, or Andrea, when you were talking about the Indian philosophers who are, for example, Patanjali, do they say anything about the creative aspect? For example, does articulation involve the creative aspect of these birds? And similarly, Leonie, like for example, when you were showing us that video about the cow coming to the person and saying hi, but what if, and this is just a question, like if I'm just being creative and imaginative, did you have any discussions or did you come across any feelings where you felt that maybe this cow is actually saying something very long worded, more than just hi or just introducing, maybe she's trying to like actually communicate with you in a, for example, yeah, like if she's talking to her calf to come here, maybe she's telling her calf to, you need to like be there in the morning, something very long worded and not just a hi or an introduction. What are your thoughts about that?
So, if I may go first, Andrea, otherwise I will forget the question. Thank you so much. So, about the cows acknowledging a familiar human in the meadow, they will greet successively, so not once. They do not vocalize once, but they will vocalize at least 2 times. And the 2 vocalizations differ. There's a lot of variation. So the second one is always longer. It has more variation in pitch and in frequency.
Okay.
So they vary. So if sound varies, it means there is symbiosis going on.
Yeah.
The moment how I am interpreting it is that the first vocalization, they open the encounter and they say, okay, we have now an interaction. And then the second one is, what is the interaction about?
Okay.
And if we look at all the literature about humans greetings, it is exactly the same. So if we encounter each other for the first time, we will say hi, which is very short, and then we will ask, how are you doing? And then you have one with more variation as well. So I think that the cows are doing, without anthropomorphizing, I think that the cows are establishing the relationship during the interaction. And then, so I have encountered, I think, 22 now different cow sounds with different bodily gestures, so to speak. And I can divide them in 3 patterns. And the patterns show that, in fact, the sound has structure. So we could say, from a linguistic perspective, there is syntax in it, which is something that linguists will never say about animal sounds. But the first is that a cow will raise her voice very fast with a steep slope from below a certain frequency, then it goes up in pitch, and then it remains flat. And the high steep of the sound will say, I need something. But it will be addressed to a human, I need something, and then the hanging sound means now. So there is it is a kind of suffix in a way that is on the steep sound, and it is meant to express, I'm hungry, I need to be milked, etc. So these urgent stuff. No, and the greeting sounds with hardly any variation, they are used between the cows and humans to denote all kinds of relations. It's really relational stuff and contact sounds in the herd.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'll give maybe a brief response. So, I mean, everyone, I'm not the expert. We have other, linguists and so on who can speak more authoritatively on definitions of language, because you've provided these 2 criteria of communicative and creative, right? I don't know, but people in rhetoric might say you need to have interlocutors, someone listening, and I don't know, response and other things for criteria for language or communication, right? I don't think, of course, in fable and fiction, you'll have animals telling their own story, right? And things like this. And for ancient Indian literature, that definitely is a thing. I don't think grammarians were granting that sort of creative power, let's say. But this also comes from, again, this sort of context where sacred texts were not created by any humans, right? This is divine. And so it's apaurisheia. So it's not, humans also didn't create the things that really mattered, right? So the acts of creation are less important than the transmission, right? And in this sort of a context, animals can really be almost, non-human animals can be on par with human speakers as reproducers of texts, as lectors, right, for singing chants and so on. Not 100%, but because here, what I've written about is bringing in new materialists' work, where we're not going to be worried about creativity. We're going to be worried about everything like body and idea and language all tied together, and the animals' bodily productions of whether it's text or language, speech, and so on, is an iterative act, and that is the agency. And because an animal, for example, reciting a mantra could produce an effect, and it's the iterative act, regardless of whether it's a priest, like a Brahmin priest conducting a ritual, that produces a result or an effect. And in the same way, the animal speech, the parroted speech, which the priest should have, it should be parroted 100%. parroted speech. And it's the iteration and reiteration that just has the agency. And this is something the new materialists write about quite well, and I'm expressing imperfectly, but so that it's all tied up between word and language and body. And that's the iterative act that is the agency, and not really being so worried about creativity for having language at all. All the time, language is not creative, unoriginal, and so on. But thank you for a lovely question.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Dan, do you have please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Hi. I had a question for Leonie as well. Possibly building a bit on the last question. It's about your research. Well, when you were giving your presentation, I was thinking a lot about power dynamics. Because a cow, of course, will have a certain relationship to a human who is milking them. I was struck, especially when you said you also milk the cows. I was wondering if you could maybe tell a bit about how the nature of the relationship between the cows, if you've noticed this, how it impacts the way they vocalize and they communicate with each other. Is there a sense that some cows will give more respect to bullies, other cows that bully them maybe, or are certain cows more friendly and talk to each other? Do certain cows not talk to each other? And how does that relate to humans? So you said something about strangers, but how does it work to humans that cows are familiar with, but who may not milk them, for example, or have a different relationship to them than the extractive farming relationship?
Yes, so thank you so much for your question. So I'm seeing this in the same way as Andrea just pointed out within a new materialism. So it is really that the whole assemblage brings out a certain effect, and how the cows, the practices that surround the cows bring out a certain cow, so to speak. So the dairy farming practices, the cow may greet, but they will never be greeted back by the farmer. And I did a lot of interviews with the farmers, and the farmers don't know that means a greeting. So it is knowledge that is not there. Although when I speak to their mothers who are in the 80s or in the 90s, and they had a different way of doing dairy farming than their sons, they will all tell me, oh no, of course, the cow's greeting. So the knowledge was there, but it is lost in a generational transmission somehow. So the dairy, the cow, but Amigo I showed with this volunteer, they are always hugging and touching each other. So this is a cow surrounded by, although it is part of the meat industry, Amigo also knows this human who surrounds Amigo with, let's say, care and compassion practices. And that brings out this relationship of Amigo approaching the human at the end of the fence and touching each other. So in a way, all this materiality and within the relationship, what is going to establish and routinized by the practices brings about specific gestures and vocalizations by the cows. But having said that, all the cows have individual personalities. So not every cow greets. And if a cow like Beatrice likes to greet, it doesn't mean that she's greeting on Monday and Tuesday all the time. So they are not machines, but it is really depending on the relationship and the mood and the individuality of the encounter. And also the certain sounds and the gestures that they produce can be very different per barn. So the cows have an extreme, and I don't think that we realize that, but the cows have a huge range of expressions, but only in a certain farm, only a restriction of the range comes out. So you have to go to a lot of different situations in order to have an idea about the range of the expressions. Thank you.
Katharina?
Yes, thank you, everyone. It's very interesting. I have a question for Andrea. My question is basically, do you think there's a survival of this? I understand that the language and speech here is not necessarily original or creative because that's more of a Western bias. But it's interesting that it implies in texts that there's some sort of expression anyways, not necessarily creative, but like some expressiveness of these animals. And if you see some kind of cultural today in contemporary Southeastern world of this kind of practices that are interested in this kind of expressiveness. And to this, maybe I was thinking about the case of the Thai Elephant Orchestra. That's this orchestra made by elephants, where the humans more like give them some instruments that because they were unemployed after the prohibition of logging work by elephants. And I think a lot of that example, because it's this space of experimentation but also expressiveness, and I would like to know, based on your work, if you see this more of this kind of contemporary survival of this animal expressiveness. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a little bit of a hard question. I'm not sure if I understand fully, but so a lot of these ideas of parrot teachers continue in texts in the 17th and 18th century even. And so it's not like something that ended just because I'm writing mostly about earlier times. It's not something that ended in a distant past. Gosh, I don't know. I mean, you have elephants are used in temples even today, and they do a salutation to the gods and things. So that's still communicating expressiveness. Birds are used, have been, right, for omens, like I said, but even today you'll find birds used as fortune tellers, but they're picking the cards, right? I'm not quite sure. Maybe you could tell me more about what sorts of survivals you're looking for, but these are things you can find today, on the street or around. Expressiveness. I mean, I think more because of animal rights, a lot of people are just trying to work to let animals be themselves, and an elephant's expressiveness would be being in its own, his or her own herd, and digging in the dirt, and other sorts of activities. I don't know. Do you have a follow-up to clarify more of what?
I was thinking, because, sorry, maybe my English is not perfect, but of this kind of cultural practices where resonates this kind of idea that it's in the cultural landscape about the possibility of these beings being expressive and having this kind of speech, because I don't know much about Southeastern culture, Latin American, but some of these practices, you said, for example, the fortune-telling birds that pick some cards, papers, I've seen them here in my country, like it still exists. But I was more wondering if you knew about some kind of these kind of practices that survive somehow today or have underlying this concept of expressivity. I hope I made myself clear.
Yeah, thank you. It's perfectly intelligible. I feel like I can't think of examples, but I think a lot of this might be, from the beginning of the European encounter. You have a lot of other sorts of colonial influences and pressures and pushing down and oppressing most of the other sorts of cultural traditions. and sort of prioritizing other interests in science and all kinds of other things, and Western ideas of science, right? So I don't know. I don't think I have any insights into, a new no. We have other sorts of connections between tribal communities and tigers and other, as different sorts of political recipients of oppression and having their land taken from them. And so it's not always a language question. Maybe I'm missing something though.
Yeah. And like we are almost out of time, but can I ask one question to Anna? So I was very fascinated with you started with that like the fact that some languages did not have the concept of music, like some indigenous so I'm wondering what is your sense of music, what is the definition of music in relation to animal language, animal sounds, because often we sort of conflate them. The musician loves to recreate that the animal sounds.
Yes, the classical one is, of course, the whales, where sound composers and, their major, you can download Song of Whales, Y songs, Y language. There's, a big boundary line there. But what I'm interested in and is how the animalization of humans created a flimsy boundary line between music and language. And so what happens is that this is the 18th and 19th century. This is the moment that the disciplines of linguistics and musicology as such, of course, historical philology existed before. This is this transition at the end of the 19th century. And what is interesting to me is that if these people sounded like something that was unclassifiable as either music, which means at that time, but even today, that it's supposed to have a clear pitch. Incredible after 1 century of avant-garde music, but that's the defining element, is the issue of pitch. A lot of the treatises of how musicology came about is if you have clear pitches, you have music. If you do not have clear pitches, so of course the example was, for example, Darwin's Tierra del Fuego visit was used a lot in musicology treatises. They only had percussion instruments and they had no pitch. And so this absence of pitch was seen as an absence of music. Therefore, animal sounds that are more pitch-like, whale songs or birds, are considered usually to the word song or comes up, right? Or melodious or these characteristics. However, when humans are emitting the sound, the problem is that a lot of these musics do not have a clear boundary. They're not pitch-determined musics. A lot of non-Western musics are not pitch-determined musics. And the indigenous people, I also work on indigenous film, they're in Northern South America, learn their songs from animals still today. They're transmitted through bees or through birds. And so, or an specific example is you're making a film with indigenous filmmakers and a bird makes a call. And then they see that as a mythical call that you have to stop, make a ritual, because this mythical being lives in the place that we're filming, and you have to follow a ritual before continuing with the technology of filming. So what is interesting to me is who is able to determine what the bird is saying. Why is that considered a language? It's generally not considered a language, but also there's this very flimsy boundary line. Once you leave the philosophical interpretation of the boundary line between animals and humans in the late 19th century, which determined the boundary between music and non-music, and who was able to have it, and between music and language. So there's always this groupings of expressiveness, humming, lament, women's lament. Lament usually has a type of non-pitch characteristic, that's a classical one, and other types of sound. And all of those sounds obfuscate a clear definition of music, which is why ethnomusicology became a separate discipline for a long time, because this is untreated in pitch-related definitions of music. So I could go more into that, but that's usually the determinant factor in a historical determination of the boundary line between the two in the West. Yeah.
That's interesting. So probably we should like study a cow. That's a great example of that. Yeah, not pitch, but it is a wonderful maybe music. Okay, so we are out of time. So thank you so much for everybody, and especially 3 speakers for amazing papers.